My name is James Batchelor. I'm editor-in-chief of GameIndustry.biz. I'm a long-running journalist in the industry, but I'm also a massive gamer, and Croc is one of my fondest memories. Hanging around my cousin's house. This was very kind of around the time that PlayStation and Nintendo 64 had just come out. I don't believe I had a Nintendo 64 at the time. I think I was still on the original Nintendo. So the whole world of like kind of early 3D games was new to me, and it was just kind of mind-blowing playing these sort of things. And to go from, kind of your typical side-scrolling Mario games to a 3D platformer like Croc, I think Croc might have been the first 3D platformer I played, was just a whole nother step up in terms of what games could be. It felt like a whole new level of what video gaming could be, and I just absolutely adored it. There was so much to enjoy in the way the game played, the character, the music, the levels, the layout, everything. Even right down to the puns in the level names. And I remember just spending hours, days with my cousin, just working through Croc 1 together, like taking it in turns and just absolutely loving it. When I first played, it was Croc, the central character, was the draw. It was just, in an era of so many kind of iconic platforming mascots, people like Mario and Sonic, and obviously you had Crash Bandicoot, the year before. Like Croc standing out as like instantly a lovable character was amazing. Like, this little crocodile with a backpack, he was incredibly cute. It was the voice acting. Voice acting obviously was so new in video games. Like, we already had Mario going, yeah, wah, wahoo. But Croc also kind of having his own little personality, like the little high pitch yazoo as you do like a massive ground pound. Like it became a thing. Like I found myself saying yazoo as like jumping off things at the park. Like it was such a lovable creature, such a lovable character that that kind of kept you going. Like you enjoyed playing as that character, and it kind of served as the gateway to the rest of the game's cuteness. Like collecting the little gobbos that are hidden around the different levels. Like you wanted to collect them, you wanted to rescue all of them because they're so sweet and vulnerable. Especially like finding the hidden colored gems across the hidden throughout the level, and then you find one that's in a cage through the secret door at the end. Like you started to feel motivated to do this. That was like my first impressions. But then, like I think as I've grown older and I've looked at video games through more kind of adult eyes and certainly through kind of more professional eyes, I really start to recognize now what the team were doing back then. Like early 3D platformers were amazing. Like every single one was a revolution to me because they were all trying to solve this problem that no one had ever done. Video games had for decades before been a very kind of left to right affair when it comes to platforming games. You start at the left hand side of the screen, you could proceed through the level, overcome the obstacles, you get to the end goal on the right. Navigating a 3D space. Navigating a 3D space was something that no one really knew how to do, and everyone had their own solutions. Nintendo showed this with Mario 64 with their kind of big open world ish kind of levels. Crash Bandicoot had done this kind of gauntlets where you're running kind of rather than left to right, you're essentially running from the back of the level to the front of the level. And Croc splitting it into these kind of little room size sections. Like you felt like you were exploring each level. Like it wasn't just there wasn't a start to end goal structure to the level, but it wasn't a simple A to B affair. There were different hidden chambers to find. There were different secrets to find. And you look back now, and it's like this was really impressive that a team that had never made a 3D game before managed to make a very kind of easy to navigate 3D space, one that you instantly understood what you were doing, where you were trying to go, where secrets might be, and you had this lovable character to drive through it. It was just amazing. The level puns like gave the game a personality, like even just as much as Croc did. Like it wasn't just grass stage level 1 or volcano stage level 3. It was shouting lava, 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 which is obviously a pun on a song of the time. Like it was brilliant. Like it encouraged you to open the next level. It was like, I wonder what they call the next one. Bond fan that I am, I love that. I'm pretty sure there was a level called License to Chill, like that. And it was a snow level. Like it gave a sense of fun. It's so rare nowadays to have a team like this, to have a team of 12 or so people who have a lot of creative freedom to create something that goes on to become as popular, as big, and as potentially influential and certainly revolutionary as something as Croc. Like the industry nowadays, like you look back at titles like Croc and they just wouldn't be made today because everything would be, analyzed to death by, executives trying to work out where the opportunities in the market were. Everything would be based on what is popular, what has worked before. This was the joy of, the 90s developers who were trying to break new ground in early 3D. Was there was no precedent, there was no, kind of rule book, there were no established hits. They were free to make their own choices, free to make their own rules, free to make their own rules, and lay the groundwork for what would come afterwards. And it must have been such an amazing and like privileged time to be making games back then, because you sure as heck wouldn't get that freedom now. Croc is one of those games where there's a real, almost like a spread out community around it. Like I wrote this article about the making of Croc, and when it was published, I jokingly put on Twitter, like, now time to campaign for a remaster. And it was one of those games that I remember well. I remember playing, I remember fondly, but it's not one that comes up in conversation a lot, because a lot of the conversation around the most seminal, like, influential titles of the 90s tends to come around like the typical ones, Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Banjo Kazooie, like certainly in platforming terms, and then others in other genres. And Croc is one that kind of doesn't get as much attention as it deserves, which is a large part of why I wanted to write that article. When I announced on Twitter, I published this article, now to campaign for a remaster, the amount of people replying, "Oh, I loved that game, absolutely, yeah, I'd love to see a remaster," etc. I kind of felt like I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who remembers how good this game was. I'm not the only one who wants more. It beggars belief that Croc hasn't had a remaster before now, at least kind of attention. Like I say, like the nostalgia for the 90s has been going on so long. We've seen how well things like the Crash Bandicoot remakes and the Spyro remakes have performed. I mean, blimey, even Gex the Gecko is getting remakes, and those kind of are notoriously not great games. And it's heartbreaking to see all these things that are getting remakes and not see Croc. So, like, to finally know that there is there is a Croc remaster in the works, it's about damn time. I don't think I fully appreciated back in the day how well the levels of Croc are designed. In the conversation I had with Nick Cusworth, who was on the team, he talked to me about how the levels were designed along the lines of, he referred to 2D platformers like Yoshi's Island, where you can take any screenshot and instantly know what it is you are supposed to be doing in that space. In any given moment of any level, you know what you're meant to do. And you look back at how Croc is laid out with this different, like, room-like structure, and in any given situation, you know where you're meant to be heading. There's a clear exit, but there are likely to be some secrets, and you might see some hints of stuff that you might want to investigate. But there's a clear exit, and it's impossible to get lost in this. Other 3D platformers where they were trying to do the kind of the more open structure, certainly on the N64 with things like Super Mario 64 and Banjo Kazooie, because they have the capability of doing these large seamless levels, certainly large for the time. It was easy to get lost, or at least not know where you were meant to be heading, because there were so many possibilities. But with Croc, it was all kind of directed, but you never felt like you were being led by the hand. It was almost inherent that you knew, right, that's the main exit over there, so I'm going to head that way. But before I go that way, I am going to rescue that gobbo that I see up on that floating platform. I'm going to get that colored gem that I see over there. I'm going to make sure I collect as many gems as I possibly can before I clear out. You were guided, but never led. And I think and even today, that's such a hard way to design games. It's such a hard thing to nail down and get right. So to see a team that had never made a 3D game do this in like the early 90s, the mid 90s, it just baffles me. And I don't think I fully appreciated that enough back at the time. I am so looking forward to the Croc remaster, because I have missed games like Croc, and specifically Croc Legend of the Gobbos, since first playing it in the 90s. We've had a kind of resurgence of these 90s style 3D platformers. We've had the Crash Bandicoot remakes, we've had the Spyro remakes, and you play them. Like, I never played the Crash Bandicoot games in the day, but playing the remakes, it feels like, wow, this is how video games used to be. This is how video games should be, because there's not as much of this style anymore. So to go back to a property that I'm familiar with, I can't wait. I've honestly been looking at watching videos of people playing through Croc on like YouTube and like watching it in its original PS1 blockiness, and I still get excited at the idea of playing that. The music instantly takes me back to that time. The soundtrack is one of my go-to work soundtracks for, I'll just have it on in the background to kind of give me that lift up. And like, it's such a like chirpy, happy, uplifting soundtrack. Like, nostalgia always plays a large part in these things. You always go back to games and worry that is it not going to be as good as I remember? But just watching it in its original form online, it absolutely is what I remember. It absolutely is going to be what I remember. And I cannot wait to see how it looks when it's fully refreshed and fully revamped. Some of the remasters we've seen in the last few years have breathed new life into something and made it feel brand new. I'm looking forward to playing a Croc remaster with my kids because my kids are used to kind of more modern games, but introducing them to an absolute classic presented in a modern style, I just can't wait for it.
So my name is Mitch Wallace. I'm currently a Forbes contributor covering the video game industry. I've also written about games for several different outlets like Wired, Tech Radar, Games Radar. Contributed to a couple cool kids books by Scholastic about video games. And then, sort of apropos to this interview, I sort of got my start in games writing about Croc for a UK print publication called Retro Gamer, and been writing about games ever since. So my gaming experience before I was a pro, and sort of how I got introduced to Croc. Well, I mean, I've been gaming since the Atari days, so mid to late '80s, introduced to the Atari 2600. After that, the NES, all those classics on the NES like Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Brothers. And I was just hooked from the get-go. Got my PlayStation in 1995, around launch. Funny story, I had actually rented a PlayStation from a local video game store with like, Mortal Kombat 3 and Battle Arena Toshinden. And it just felt like the future, the PlayStation. The N64 came out the following year in '96, and I think if you were a PlayStation owner in 1996, you were kind of like side eyeing that console because Super Mario 64 obviously launched with that machine, and there was nothing quite comparable on the Sony PlayStation to Super Mario 64. We had Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot obviously was a lot more linear. It wasn't free roaming like Super Mario 64. So I think that's where that PlayStation jealousy kind of crept in. Like we want something like Super Mario 64, but Crash Bandicoot's kind of like it. But then the gaming magazines started talking about Croc, early '97, I want to say it was, and it immediately caught my interest. And because I was just into 3D platformers, I loved sort of colorful, more family friendly stuff at the time, um, and Croc just looked like it just fit the bill. It was a cute character, colorful world, kind of pastel colors, and the kind of the key thing there was it was like more free roaming than Crash Bandicoot, and I was like, oh, that I'm interested in. It's like there's more. There's going to be more to this than Crash in a way, and yeah, and just sort of tracked it up until its release in, I want to say it was like September-ish '97, and got it on release day. This is my original Croc copy from back in the day. That also kind of coincides with the dual analog controller, which I actually have right here. The dual analog that I had, that I played Croc on back in '97, and this is the precursor to the DualShock, and it's kind of a rare controller at this point. It's got the concave analog sticks, it's got the longer like handles, some differences on the shoulder buttons too, and I was thrilled because Croc supported analog control, which up until that point PlayStation hadn't introduced. PlayStation when it launched was kind of the edgy game console. It was like you had like Wipeout and Loaded and more sort of mature angled games. Whereas the N64 was, right out of the gate with Super Mario 64, it did have that family friendly flair. And I think maybe even starting around the time of Croc, PlayStation was starting to get some of those, just games that had a friendlier aesthetic. Like, it wasn't so gritty, it wasn't so adult or grown up. And I think there was probably like a subset of PlayStation gamers like me who were sort of craving, I guess, some more of that innocent gaming that we had experienced on, say, the Super Nintendo or the NES. And Croc, I think, even though it was 3D, it was kind of a throwback to those days of like bright colors and just like a fun adventure that you would go on. It's not heavy, it's not serious. It's just and there's a lot of good humor in Croc, with the gobos, gobos, potato. Um, and yeah, the music was incredible. Justin Charbona, I actually interviewed him for the Retro Gamer article I wrote, and that was definitely part of the draw for me as well. Because as soon as you drop into the first world, first level, um, there's just like this serene music that sort of envelops you in that space. And another kind of funny story, slightly embarrassing. Um, when I would play Croc, a lot of times I wouldn't actually play Croc. I would just like sit in the world and like make up my own game, like in my imagination. And I would just spend, an hour just like running around the same level, like looking at rocks, listening to the music, being at peace. I was a strange kid. But it was sort of like, I was also kind of a lonely kid too. And Croc was one of those games that was sort of like a balm or like it just made me feel good because it wasn't so heavy, it wasn't so serious. So yeah. What surprised me about sort of diving into the history of Croc? Um, well, first of all, it was just an honor talking to a lot of those guys because they made this game that I loved growing up, and it was. I think one of the things that surprised me was the sort of pioneering nature of that era of game development, especially in 3D games. It was like even now if you go back and play Croc, it's you can feel the developers sort of like trying to figure out how 3D games are supposed to work. Um and actually this week I played Croc with the dual analog again and was actually kind of surprised just all these years later, even after I did a lot of sort of the deep diving into Croc, that they actually got a lot of stuff right off the bat. Like, um, I know when you control Croc digitally, it's more of the tank controls, like sort of Tomb Raider style. And I also know talking to Nick Cussworth, the lead designer, he said that they got the dual analog like really late in development.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he wasn't thrilled about that, and he didn't think the implementation was up to his standards. But using it again, even last night, like you move the camera with the right stick. Croc has some nuanced degrees of movement with the left stick. Like they got the elements in there. It's like it wasn't as polished as say like a Mario 64, which that was like some black magic or something. I'm not sure what. Yeah, so that was surprising. Just you know that they did get so much right, start out of the gate, having to figure stuff out themselves. There weren't examples to look at. It's like I think back to more PlayStation history. It's like no, Spyro the Dragon wouldn't come along until like a year later in '98. That was more perfected the 3D formula, or like Gex Enter the Gecko, or there was sort of more of like a tidal wave of stuff that could tweak those base elements that came along in within Croc. Um, and I think the other thing that surprised me when I was talking to a lot of those guys was just the passion they had for that project. Whether it was the art or the coding or the designing, they really cared about that game, and that I find that era of game development just fascinating in general because it was smaller teams. It feels like there was a lot more passion. People were closer to the projects. It wasn't teams of 300 people. I won't name any studios, but um, yeah. So I find that era very inspiring, charming, um, uh, and it's no surprise that something like Croc came out of that sort of soup. Yeah, sort of that naivete and that sort of scrappiness. Like there's a magic to that with anything creative. Like if you're just sort of pushing through the fog or the mist and just like mapping new terrain as you go, like yeah, there's a something special about that, I think. The music is incredible. The score, the Justin Charvona's soundtrack um, was a huge reason why I uh, just like to just sort of stick around and explore Croc's world. Um, and he used some really unconventional like instruments in the soundtrack. Like it's very like trumpet heavy. He said that he used theremin, in a lot of like the spookier segments, like the underground levels. Um, there was like clarinet or oboe. I was never sure exactly which one it was, and sort of the more serene levels. So yeah, unconventional soundtrack, but definitely helped give Croc its own identity. How did I sort of find out that Croc might be coming back? Um, I don't know. I mean, obviously there was the sort of cryptic tweet from Jez San. That was, the more like the official tip off. But I feel like for years there's just been, the rumor mill is always churning, and it's always like I don't know if it was more of a rumor as more of like there was like a growing surge of people who wanted Croc to come back. Like everyone who grew up with Croc kind of looked around at some point and was like, okay, well, Crash got a remaster, Spyro got remastered. Well, we like this game too. We loved Croc, so like I think it was more of like a groundswell of just people just sort of demanding that something be done with the franchise, whether like a new Croc come out or they remastered the first two. Um, so I think by the time I saw Jez's tweet, it almost felt like it had been confirmed already. It was like, oh, like I knew this was happening, but now Jez said it's happening, so it's for sure happening. Um, and I think after talking to the guys in 2016, like Nick and Jez and all them, like I knew there was some desire there to bring it back. I think even when I spoke to Jez in 2016, he was throwing around the idea of like maybe bringing it back. I can't quite remember; it's been a while, but yeah, how will new kids come to Croc? I almost made a new kids on the block joke, but I could have rhymed it too. The standards for gaming have changed so drastically. If you're a young person who's heavy into gaming now, you're now viewing Croc through. I mean, even if you've played the Spyro and Crash remasters slash remakes, those were retooled in pretty serious ways to accommodate a modern audience. Um, so I think a lot of young people will come to it interested. Will people be viewing the Croc remaster through sort of nostalgia glasses, even with like updated visuals, sort of thing? I don't know. That's always a tough one when old games get remastered. That's always sort of at the forefront of the discourse because it's like, um, when you play a game, an older game that's been remastered, you can feel that it's dated in some ways, because it's from a particular era, it's from a particular time period, particular sort of uh, sort of design philosophies of that whatever decade that was. Um, Do I think that people will still appreciate it? I think absolutely. I think as a sort of like historical piece, people will definitely appreciate it. As a nostalgia piece, yes. And I think they'll still be able to enjoy it because back in 1997, when I got my shiny new dual analog, it was like everything was new. This was all novel. It was like I didn't have any standards by which to judge Croc other than like this is the first sort of truly 3D game on the PlayStation that I can roam around in and explore. So it was like it doesn't matter if these controls are kind of janky. They were the best we had. And now I just sound like old man screaming at clouds. But
So my name is Jack Yarwood, and I'm a staff writer at Time Extension, which is a retro-focused gaming publication. I became aware of Croc quite early in my gaming kind of life. Like I did grow up with a Super Nintendo and a Genesis, but when I guess I got a PlayStation, I was always on the lookout for that kind of next step of like you know like what would be like the next kind of platformer that I would fall in love with, and Croc was one of those kind of titles that I fell in love with kind of early on in owning a PlayStation, because it was kind of that evolution of things, like Mario and Sonic, but in 3D. Yeah, I feel like Croc was an interesting part, like an interesting moment in 3D gaming, because I guess N64 had Super Mario 64, and Sony had obviously had Crash Bandicoot by the point that Croc had come out. But things like Spyro hadn't come out yet, and there was still that feeling that every team that was working in 3D in gaming sort of had to do it and figure things out by themselves. It wasn't like people, I guess, looking at previous examples of 3D in games and like how they would handle specific scenarios. So you get all these interesting kind of idiosyncrasies between different projects and different 3D platformers from that point. So like with Croc, like the movement is like it's like driving a vehicle. Like you can go backwards and like things like that you don't see in other 3D platformers at the time. Like, a lot of the way that's handled in other games is that, if you want to, go back on yourself in a 3D space, you have to kind of move it like an analog stick, or move the directional buttons to go in a full circle. Whereas like with Croc, you can reverse kind of like a truck. It's like all these interesting things that kind of happened through kind of the experimentation of kind of through developers having to kind of work things out by themselves, which is something that you don't really you don't really get nowadays, because it's sort of like it is set in stone, kind of these tenets. And I feel like Croc's position in the gaming industry is kind of being one of those pioneers that kind of had to figure out these issues and kind of overcome them. I feel like the character design of Croc was definitely one of the more kind of special elements about it, because I guess there's that whole history there that people kind of allude to with like like Argonaut as a company had obviously been quite heavily involved with Nintendo, and like the origins of this project, whenever people talk about it, it's always in sort of in relation to kind of that Miyamoto connection, and kind of showing it to Miyamoto passing on it, and then obviously Fox Interactive getting involved with publishing. And I feel like the character, what could have happened then, with having to replace, like, in the early drafts, like they mentioned, kind of using Nintendo characters to then go to like an original character. It kind of lives and dies on whether that character is charming, and whether it's like a character that can carry kind of a mascot platformer. And I feel like Croc definitely does in multiple ways. Like just the design, like it's a very simple design. It's just kind of like a a big-eyed crocodile, but then adding like a backpack on, and like just the way that, you know, it's animated and the way that the character runs. So you have this kind of elongated kind of like at an angle kind of run, which is it's kind of, it all kind of lends this sense of, you know, this character's on an adventure, and it's something that's like really kind of, I guess when I was younger, it's sort of like endeared me to it, because it felt like, you know, this big kind of adventure and this character's kind of going on it. And yeah, well, I think the really interesting thing about Croc is that they did have that relationship with Nintendo, and like they kind of came away from it, and they decided obviously to make this game that was kind of more family friendly kind of platformer. And if you look at kind of how Crash Bandicoot and games like that were kind of advertised, it was kind of like on the edgier side of like the platformer. And I feel like kind of they were kind of the counterpart to something like Rare on like Nintendo hardware, doing kind of Banjo-Kazooie and kind of those kind of games that were kind of like all age games. Croc was definitely, yeah, Croc kind of feels like a Nintendo game on a PlayStation system, and obviously, you know, ported to other devices. But I think that's what's so kind of special about it. It has those kind of sensibilities. And I mean, there is something that's worth talking about in terms of like level design, because one of the big things about, you know, 3D, moving into 3D wasn't just like, you know, how do we move a character around a 3D space? It was like, how do we create these 3D spaces so they don't just look like a bunch of corridors? And I think like that's something, when you look back at Croc, you can kind of see the battle that's going on with the designers in terms of like, how do we make these feel like vast worlds and not just kind of these like interlinked kind of corridors that people go down. And I feel like a lot of that is just down to like the creativity of the team that made it, in terms of, you know, like the kind of the obstacles that they came up with, the move set for Croc. Like I think at the time, like it was very rare for, you know, characters to have like a ledge grab and things like that in a 3D platformer, and you know, just the fact, you know, Croc can like swim and like have this kind of all these different moves, and it's like it's kind of a testament to that ambition and kind of a meeting of that kind of technology, but also that kind of, you know, clever design sensibility to create this kind of this toolkit for players to kind of mess around with in this space. It was interesting looking at kind of Fox Interactive at the time, because so many of the properties that Fox were doing were licensed. You know, it was like related to The Simpsons or, you know, Alien or things like that. And like what was interesting kind of looking at press releases and things for Croc was, you know, this idea that there might even be a Croc TV show. And you know, it was kind of like it seemed like a really kind of big investment on Fox's part to kind of pick it up and kind of run with it. And there were these plans to kind of make it, you know, really launch it as a character. And even though there were kind of many games that followed kind of the original Croc, like, you know, both like a kind of like a sequel from the original team and like spin-offs from other studios, it's like really interesting to kind of see that kind of initiative happen, because I feel like the common sense approach would be to do what all kind of big publishers do and just be like, we're focusing on what's, you know, popular and what's already tested, what's tried and true. And I feel like, you know, a lot of this story about kind of the making of Croc is going to be about kind of Argonaut and how they are kind of these technical wizards and kind of, you know, design geniuses. But like I also feel like there is some credit, I guess, for Fox as well for kind of, you know, pursuing this when it kind of stands out from the rest of the catalog. The music in Croc, yeah, definitely is just it's like incredibly atmospheric. It's like the type of music that you kind of want from like a 3D platformer that isn't like in your face, but it's very much, it kind of gradually kind of leads you into the world. It's something like the soundtrack is one of those soundtracks that I come back to, like in terms of, you know, like playlists on YouTube and like things like that, because it is just yeah, it's just one of those ones that has kind of a, I guess, both like a nostalgic place in my heart, and that's something like when I was, there is that kind of I encountered it at a certain age, so it's kind of stuck in my brain. But then on the other end, like, as I've got older and as I've spoken to more musicians in the games industry, it's just like my appreciation of it has got even greater because I can sort of see the effort that goes into stuff like that. Yeah, I do think like the music does a great job in sort of leading, I guess, lending to that kind of adventure thing where it is basically like Croc is, kind of going out into the world and having this big adventure. And I feel like the music does a lot to kind of, give people that kind of sense of kind of a world. And, these aren't just kind of corridors, like that people are going down, but like a connected world with like these different kind of climates and kind of like and things to kind of discover and secrets to find. Time Extension, we do cover kind of everything that happens in the retro space in terms of remasters and remakes and things like that, because they're just becoming more common. I think people have realized that there's kind of not just kind of a commercial incentive in terms of bringing these things back, but there's also kind of that preservation aspect as well in terms of making games from the past available again. So we do cover a lot of remasters, remakes, reissues, and please don't ask me to describe the differences between those because it's kind of ever shifting. When I heard that Croc was kind of a candidate for kind of being remade or remastered, it kind of made complete sense to me because it's a game that I feel like a lot of people have a fondness for and would buy again on that kind of just on that fact. But I feel like it's also because of the point in time in which it came out, it makes complete sense that for someone to revisit it and kind of sand off those hard edges and like kind of basically do the things that have since become conventions that the Croc team wouldn't have known about at the time. They were kind of working in the dark, I guess, like when it comes to stuff. So I feel like I was extremely excited to hear it that Croc might be coming back because or is coming back because it is like it's like a prime candidate for it, and I feel like there's a lot of lesser candidates that have already come back that it feels like it makes sense for Croc to definitely. I feel like one of the interesting things about like re-releasing Croc and kind of like revisiting it in a way that people can switch between kind of old and new in a way, like it's a good kind of opportunity for people to who may have heard about this game over the years. People now kind of being presented with it. People can go back now who haven't played it and experience that and get an idea of kind of those what it was like for people back then to play it, but at the same time benefit from the hindsight of this is kind of Croc was made at a very kind of experimental time for kind of 3D games.
So I heard about Croc a couple of years ago, heard that it might be available for a remaster. And the issue at the time was that nobody had source code available. So I did a little hunt around the internet and found out about this Croc Definitive Edition that someone had released anonymously and did a little bit of digging and was able to find them. And it turns out they had found source code some years earlier on the internet, and we were able to get hold of that and do some experiments and sort of confirm that we could be able to make a remaster. My role here has been sort of the project lead here at Titanium Studios, And so I'm also the managing director, so I run the team, and but also my background's technical, so I do some of the engineering, but we have some really good engineers on the team here.
I'm a lead engineer here at Titanium. I've come onto the Croc project to help with all sorts of things, really. But a lot of the kind of user experience side of things, making the controls feel a little bit more modern, getting some more kind of fluid camera control in there as well. And also helping with some of the graphics, because we wanted to make it look a little shiny and new. I think when we get the source code, the first thing we try and do is figure out what's needed to be able to compile it again. How do we actually get this thing running in some form, maybe even without graphics, just to see if we can run it.
I mean, I think also the first thing I do is try and see if we can figure out if it's all there or if there's enough of it there. We don't necessarily need all of the code. We don't need the code for the original platforms necessarily, but we certainly need, the gameplay code and the things that make Croc Croc. Yeah, a lot of the game logic, like the gameplay, is written in a language called, I've forgotten, Argonaut scripting language, I think it is. And yes, it's a very customized system. And the tools for those are all lost, actually. So we have to sort of do some reverse engineering and sort of convert the binaries for that back into some kind of usable source code in order to be able to modify them. So while we did find source code, it was just to the sort of the final shipping game. So all of the custom tools that Argonaut had built back in the day, we don't have any of those. And we don't have any of the original data, or very little of it. And we don't have any of the original Argonaut scripting language scripts. So
part of the work we've done in like modernizing the controls, for example, means we've made some changes to how the characters might move between different states, and any kind of special input handling we might need to do in some of those transitions. And although we've got source code, we've also got a significant portion which is compiled code that we don't tend to go into and mess with if we can help it. So we've kind of got like an extra layer on top where we can hook into certain things, like, for example, detecting when a different animation plays, and then we can figure out, okay, well, what character is that playing on? And then hook into that as a kind of like workaround for being able to insert some of our own code to kind of hijack what the original was doing and smooth things out a little. So the original game had these tank controls, right? Where you had the original PlayStation controller. It didn't even come with joysticks originally. So you just had the D-pad. You just had digital inputs. And the way that they implemented that was that you would press up on the D-pad and Croc would move in whatever direction he was facing. Left and right, he would rotate left or right. And so, yeah, we call it tank controls because he kind of moved like a tank. We didn't want to completely remove that for people who have nostalgia for it, right? It's not a common approach to controls these days, but there are speedrunners who have mastered it. There are all of these players who have these memories of it. So we wanted to preserve it whilst also offering a more modern approach alongside it. And the way in which we've handled that is essentially kept the tank controls as they were, basically, on the D-pad. Meanwhile, if you want to get the more kind of modern, typical platformer control experience, you've got the joystick. And so at any point in time, you can just freely swap between them. The camera behavior will also swap. So if you start using the D-pad, the camera will fall in behind Croc and follow him around closer to how it originally behaved. Whereas if you're using the joystick, you can use the right stick as well to swing the camera around freely and have full control like you would expect from a more modern game.
Everyone has a certain expectation of how a 3D platformer plays now, and those controls at the time, which were quite innovative, but again, the original controller didn't have analog controls, and nobody knew how a 3D platformer was supposed to work back then. but we're 20 plus years later now, and everyone has certain expectations. But certainly when the analog controls were first done, you pick up the controller and it was just immediately intuitive to play and 5 times more enjoyable. So I think everyone that remembers the game is going to love having these new controls. One of the other things about Croc is it has an enormous amount of content. There's hundreds of level maps in there and thousands of textures and I think a couple of hundred models or something as well. And so the combination of sort of this volume of content and the way it was made was going to make sort of the traditional approach of having artists hand upscale and improve the quality of these assets wasn't going to work, because it was going to be too much burden on the artist to fix all of these issues. And so what we ended up coming up with was a couple of pieces of technology where it's all done by automated pipelines, but those pipelines are sort of configured and guided by artists. One of the interesting challenges on this Croc remaster has been the way the original 3D game content was created, because it was created for consoles that didn't have particularly accurate rendering. And so things like worrying about, cracks between parts of the objects, or the textures filtering smoothly, those things don't really apply to those consoles because they couldn't do any of that anyway. And if we just stick that content straight on a modern console, you find that sort of you get parts of the model that look clean, and then you get parts that look really, unpleasant with big cracks in them and unpleasant seams and what have you. So we have these, these up-resed smooth models in the game now, which came out quite good. And those are all done by a proprietary system we have here at Titanium. And then the settings for those per model or per character, per level map, etc., are set by an artist. And then the second part we have is also with the textures, and that one in particular required a lot of work to stitch all the seams back together and then upscale them in a way that had very clean seams. And so we've ended up with quite a good improvement in the visual quality and fixed a lot of, what at the time weren't issues, but are certainly issues now. And been able to do that in a way where, it wasn't 50 years of art time or anything like that on it. So, yeah. I think we do have our rendering looking more similar to the pre-rendered marketing images. And in fact, a lot of the subdivision surfaces that were probably used on the pre-renders on the poster behind are indeed, used as part of our smoothing technology. So with the music, we ended up having to source the tracks from several different places. And so in some cases, the only complete source was the PlayStation version. And those are at quite high quality, so that works out well anyway. On a couple of tracks, the PC version had complete full-length tracks that were full quality. But one of the issues with the PC version tracks is that while they were CD audio quality, in order to fit them on the CD or on the original disc, they were actually shortened. And so for the shortened ones, we didn't use those. And then quite late in development, one of the original people involved with the development, Croc, found a box of memorabilia that they had, and one of them was an audio CD that someone had put together, and they had just assembled a good portion of the tracks, not all of them, but a decent number of the tracks at CD audio quality. And so where we had them, we used those. And in fact, that CD and another earlier, I don't know what to call it, beta, but a much earlier version of the music is available in the in our museum content section of the game. I think if we're thinking about some unexpected issues that came up, the one thing that surprised me repeatedly was, I guess, the amount of content or the amount of effort that was put into the original game. And so I was sort of constantly surprised by the volume of how many models were created, how many maps were created, actually how much music there was. And that goes across the board in the scripting language scripts, for the character AI. The game was very sophisticated, I think, for the time, and probably had a lot to do with why it was so popular. I have this picture in my head that an old game from '97 is going to be quite simple and done by a small team, and I wouldn't say that was the case with Croc. I think the original team did an amazing job of just creating a very full and complete game that, again, quite surprisingly stands up very well compared to modern titles. So my belief is that the original developers will be quite pleased with what we've got. And because, yes, we've put a lot of effort into trying to make sure that the original character and feeling of the game is preserved, and the original look. And we have also put in, the extra modes so that we can, players can adjust the graphic settings to make the game look, more consistent with the original if they prefer the original look of the game. I think we've been very fortunate that, this game is close to Jez Sand's heart, and he has, given us the green light to do a really high quality remaster on it. And so I know I'm very happy that we've been able to, really do our best effort on this one and polish the game and make it look as good as, we know how to do. And I think everyone that's a fan of the original game is going to be able to see that and appreciate it.
I'm Naomi Hermans, and my involvement with Croc was to be one of the game artists, and I've had the amazing opportunity to be on the team to bring back and revisit this cultural icon from 1997. When I started, I looked into it further, of course, starting to work on it and be a bit more included in the culture. I found out more about 3D platformers from the late 90s and early 90s, and the fact that Croc was pretty much the first 3D platformer of its time is incredible. It is so amazing. Yeah, well, back in the 90s, we didn't really have the technology or the means to support a lot of polygons and make a rounded surface. So back then you really had to make do with what you were given, and that was not very much. In modern times, technology has advanced rapidly, and we're now able to support more of an art feel that is more aligned with the original creative direction that the team wanted, which is really great to be able to put into life. As an artist, while helping to develop the direction for Croc's meshes, particularly the characters and how they look when they've been up-resed, I think I most enjoyed my part to play in experimenting with these incredible sliders that the developers and engineers had put so much time and effort into, and now I can just mess with it and just push the limits of how smooth I want the character to look, or how polygonal I want it to be as it originally was, or maybe a mixture of both. Right now, looking at a lot of 3D platformers these days in modern times, stylized 3D works, like the general Nintendo ones like Mario or Kirby and things, they do have a kind of they do have like a mix of soft and harder edges. Never fully hard, because a completely hard angled surface, a corner like that, doesn't exist in the real world. So we don't want to get too close to something unreal. Having beveled edges or leaning towards bringing back some of the original polygonal aspects that make for a unique kind of proportioned mesh, especially around the snout, I found was very important to have that iconic look of Croc, especially when we're coming from the more isometric-ish view that you get from above. The gobos were very, very different. At the time in the original game, they were a single polygonal plane, just a little plane with a circular kind of texture, a paint chip really these days. It was tiny. I think I'm not sure how many pixels wide it was. It was something like less than 60 by 60. And it's incredible the amount of detail that you can get out of that, or just the impression that you can get from such a small texture. But yes, now we've had to change that up. And I actually hand painted the Gobos texture. And we didn't AI upres that because I felt, and Jason felt, that it was so iconic. And the upresing models that we found online or we were licensing weren't adequate to be able to produce the amount of detail or the mind's impression of fur that you would get from that tiny Gobos texture. The amount that was packed in this game is incredible. We had a system where we were able to see every single mesh in the entire game in one scene, and it would fill up my screen. It was incredible just to see how much work had been put into every single asset, whether that's a little fireball that's coming out of the lava or one of the platforms. And there are a lot of different platforms and a different texture for every platform. And every platform has its own code and own environment that it has to be placed in. And then alongside that are all the characters, all the rest of the environmental meshes, and you have quite an in-depth game. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me to be able to work on something like this, bringing a retro game back into the modern visual hemisphere is something I'll never be able to do again. These things are limited, those retro games, and I think it's gonna be one of the highlights of my career as a video game artist to be able to work on this. When the old gamer starts to play this revisit to Croc, I think that, well, what we hope for is for a sense of nostalgia to be triggered and for the original game to feel the same, but the visuals to be closer to what the player may have thought it looked like or imagined it looked like after years and years of dreamlike nostalgia. And that's what we hope for. As a new gamer coming into this Croc remaster, they will likely realize that it is a remaster of an older game, just mainly due to making the comparison between what is currently on the market. When you have a remaster of Croc up against things like Baldur's Gate or Counter-Strike 2, the difference in game mechanics and the requirements from game developers are very different in these modern times. So I'm sure that new gamers coming to this Croc remaster would be able to tell the difference. However, there is a certain magic about Croc. The simplicity of just having a platformer where you're controlling this character and exploring the world and going through and finding this story and finding the puzzle pieces and unlocking all the little mysteries. There's a certain charm to that I think some games may have lost these days in becoming too complicated.
So my name is Zane Van Yperen. I am basically just someone who loved Croc as a kid. I was born in 94. Croc was released in 97. I played. Despite all of that, I actually suck at the game. I'm horrendous at it. I can run through the forest island easily enough, almost as good as the speedrunners. But after that, and especially once you hit the desert levels, I just drop off a cliff. I'm horrendous. The way this all started was, so there's a bit of history here. Basically, for context, the original PC version of Croc, in order to hear the music, you had to have the CD in the disk drive. So that was my first foray into modding Croc. I wrote what's called the horrendously named Croc PC Music Enabler, which does exactly what it says on the tin. Maybe a couple months later, I discovered people were actually using this, so I got in contact. And that's how I ended up running and managing the old Croc forums. Now, what I say next is purely hearsay, but one of these members was given the source code by an original Argonaut developer. I do not know who, however, I do have my suspicions. Well, it's probably alright for me to say this, but I reckon it was Matt Godbolt. Because as you know, I worked for a bit at Titanium Studios, the studio doing the remaster. Yeah. And as part of this, people were going around contacting all the old developers and getting as much as they had, just because a lot of this content was lost to time. And one of the archives we got was a dump of the source. Now, looking at it, because it was given to me, obviously, because I knew how to deal with it the best, and one of the subfolders of this archive matched exactly the leak I received all those years ago. Like, all the file timestamps were the same, all the contents was the same. And the person who provided that archive was Matt Godbolt. I believe that when it was leaked, if it wasn't him, it was someone he gave it to, and they copied and zipped up that subfolder of it. And eventually, that code made its way to me. And as you can imagine, being someone who loves Croc, I was ecstatic. And I was a developer too. So this was like a dream come true, almost. Yeah. Unfortunately, the code was an absolute mess and in no way usable. Couldn't build it, let alone play it. Keep in mind, at this point, I was like a young kid in a candy store. So the first thing I did was open it, look at it, and try to get it building, and failed miserably. And I tried for weeks to get the damn thing building, and it just wouldn't. Now, granted, I was a lot younger then. I didn't know as much as I do now. But eventually, over the course of a couple of months, I got it working. It was messy. It was slow, but it was working. Now, just for context, this was around 2014 I got it working. I got the code a couple of years prior, 2011, 2012, I think. But yeah, it's probably worth mentioning that parallel to this, attempting to get the original game working, I was also tinkering with the Unity game engine, and I'd written importers for all the various Croc assets, and I was hoping that it might be easier to recreate the game logic from the original assets than get the game itself working, and that ended up not being the case. So remember the Argonaut scripting language? I was actually re-implementing, the interpreter from C, which is what the code is written in, into C# for Unity. So the Unity port would have been able to run all the original scripts which controlled Croc's movement and everything else. So all of that would have been probably not identical, but pretty close. It worked, kind of. I remember I had the first level, and so the adventure begins importing. I could see the map. I couldn't see any of the enemies. I could see the waypoints of where the little bee guy that flies around. I could see where he was meant to go. And when I ran it, I could see the little platform wobbling up and down, which was controlled by a script. So I got that far, and then I realized the sheer amount of work it would take to do this just was not worth it. So I decided to abandon that and go back to getting the original game working. Well, I was working on both of these things in parallel. When I got sick of one and burned myself out on one, I'd move on to the other, and so on and so on. But working on the Unity port definitely gave me a lot of experience just with the code, with the strategy interpreter. And when I had the little platform wobbling up and down, I saw the amount of effort it took for me to get to that is like, that's all that is literally doing is taking the Y position of the platform and bobbing it up and down a bit. There's, literally that. There is so much more to do. That was one of the simplest parts in the code. And this, it's not like it's a CPU or a virtual machine that has a specification. All I had was the implementation itself. All I had was the huge mess of switch statements, the big case statement to go off. And yeah, at that point, I realized this isn't feasible, unfortunately. Croc, for me, at least back then, was almost like an addiction. I had to have my fix. There would be months where I would do absolutely nothing but Croc, and then months where I wouldn't touch it at all. Now, I was at university at the time, so take that as you will. This challenge had defeated me, and I wouldn't let it defeat me again. I guess I always wanted, in the back of my mind, to release it, to do the mini remaster, release it, not only so Croc could live again, but it's a rather impressive project. I would like to have that to my name. So pride was a small part of it. But of course, due to the clandestine nature of it, until now, that really wasn't feasible at all. I was young and extremely paranoid. As far as I knew, Jez was the one who owned the rights to Croc, and all I had was second-hand knowledge from what some of the others had told me, and they said he was made out to be this kind of evil demon creature that would sue anyone who just thought of doing something with Croc. Now, granted, I didn't have much, because I was young and stupid, but all it takes is someone like that not liking you, and they can make your life a living hell. So I tried to keep this underground as much as I could. So enter 2017. At this point, Croc was released in 97, I believe. This is when Definitive Edition, well, what is known as Definitive Edition, was actually born, when the idea was solidified. I wanted to release this as a so-called 20th anniversary edition, which is what Definitive Edition was called originally. However, one of the YouTubers that I sent it to for reviewing didn't like that and called it Definitive Edition, and it kind of stuck. The reaction was not what I was hoping. So most of the people I'd spoken to, most of the people I'd released it to, were speedrunners, because that was, at that point, that was the most active Croc community. And speedrunners, if you've dealt with them before, let's just say they can be very opinionated and critical. I knew from the get-go this would be a pretty thankless task. I didn't realize just how much, and that point just kind of soured me on Croc Communities at all. You could technically call it a remaster, but the whole goal of the Definitive Edition was to keep the game as original as possible while being able to run on modern systems without all the screwing around that you had to do before. You could just click on it and it would open correct volume levels, correct screen resolution, and it would just work. That's huge because Croc has been notoriously difficult to run on anything above Windows 98. Every now and then I did, and I still do, actually get emails from random people across the globe saying, I like what you've done, thank you, you helped me relive my childhood, that kind of thing. And it's not much, but it does actually mean quite a lot. So if you're watching this, thank you. There were 1 or 2 news articles about it over the years, a couple of YouTube videos, and I knew it wasn't big, but it was enough. The work I'd done was being noticed and being used, and I was content. This was all under an alias, and I was really strict about keeping my main online identity and the Croc identity separate. Of course, there are a couple of screw-ups there that nearly busted me, but by and large, I think I managed to stay anonymous pretty well. Well, the people who played it as a nostalgic thing, they tend to be more, at least I found, more motivated, more tech savvy. So if something was wrong in the game, they were able to, if not like tweak a config option to fix it themselves, they'd be able to email me with a bug report of what exactly was wrong and where to do it, which I really actually appreciated because it's an issue and I could fix it, and often did for the next release. I've done my piece, my work is finished. Like, so long and thanks for all the fish.